Go for it.
Who's gonna start? Becker?
You want me to start? Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us for this is the second in our series of public humanities writing talks about public writing. So our first one was several weeks ago with Jean Marie Jackson, and today we have François Furstenberg, who is going to talk about his work in public writing.
Okay, and I'm just gonna briefly introduce François, who is a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. His research explores the history of the United States and Atlantic world in the 18th and 19th century. He's written 2 books, one of them In the Name of the Father, Washington's Legacy, Slavery and the Making of a Nation, which examines images of George Washington in 19th century print culture. I'm not sure if this is necessarily considered public writing, but I saw, François, that you were an advisor for the video game Assassin's Creed, advised them on their representation of Washington. So, I mean, I personally would love to talk about that later on in the talk if you're open to that. The second book is When the United States Spoke French, 5 Refugees Who Shaped a Nation. And in terms of what we might call public writing, François has written for the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and today we're discussing essays he wrote for the American Prospect and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I think before François gives a few comments about public writing just generally, we wanted to ask panelists, or the attendees, I'm sorry, if they wanted to briefly talk about why they came to this talk, what they hope to get out of it. And I think if you raise your digital hand, I can then allow you to talk so everyone can hear you speak.
Or we can just call on people.
Okay, we have Jane Bennett.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I came because I really am a fan of François' writing, and I needed a break between my classes, and I think it's really important to think about issues of self-governance and governance now, and anything that people can do to sort of raise consciousness on that as part of an everyday part of one's life rather than just something that's needed for specialists is a good thing. So thank you.
Okay, do any of the other attendees want to raise there we go, Paige.
Hello, thanks for doing this, and you can thank today's announcements that goes out to all Hopkins employees. That's the only way I heard about this. I'm so sorry I missed the first one, but I'll be signing up for all of them from now on because after I registered this morning, I got the articles and they were fantastic. So I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation, and it's especially educational for me because I've only started working at Hopkins on June 1st in the midst of the pandemic. So I have done everything virtually. I had 6 interviews online. So it's really interesting. It's especially interesting too, because I work for the president's office and all of this administrative infinity. So this is a super, super good conversation and I really appreciate it.
Okay, Brad?
Hi, I'm Brad. I'm a first-year PhD student in the German program in modern languages and literatures, and I'm in Becker's seminar on public writing, public humanities writing. And just a note that I've been thinking a lot about my own work in translation and practicing translation, and how, you know, I thought that maybe they would be quite different between translation and public writing, but I'm really learning a lot about how they work together. And they kind of go hand in hand in some ways. So I'm just grateful to be here and to have different perspectives.
And Gabrielle?
Yeah, hi, François. So,
oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I think we lost.
Apologies.
Mute. Okay, I'm sorry, I hadn't unmuted. I always find this very confusing. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So, when I was dean of faculty, in fact, our endowment was very, very low. So I think the increase in the endowment really only came with when Bloomberg started giving us a lot of money and really under Daniels. So I'm not sure, you talk about the enormity of our endowment, but I think that's actually a very, very recent thing. And I know when I tried to hire, we couldn't match offers elsewhere or when people wanted to leave because we simply didn't have enough endowment actually to do that. So we tended to give a lot of time off and things like that to compensate for the lack of money. So I guess I'm just wondering if you aren't exaggerating a bit on the level of endowment that Hopkins had until very, very recently, I think.
Michael?
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm attending because of François' articles and because I'm known François for many years. But I think the topic of public writing is especially important for universities because universities have a whole process for defining problems that really channels through the higher administration. And public writing like François is able to raise issues and identify problems and even propose ways to think about solutions that the process internal to the university forecloses, I think. And it forecloses for all kinds of reasons: lack of imagination, rigidity of administrative structure, and also just the proliferation of people above the level of faculty department chairs. And so even in the best intentioned and most imaginative and creative higher administration, I think the structure is such that some kind of intervention from the outside could really benefit from. So that's what I think the public issue of writing and trying to identify problems that are otherwise unidentified or ignored is really highly positive.
Okay. I think that gives us a good understanding of why some of the attendees have come to this talk. And we asked François to start out with just about maybe 10 minutes background on how these particular pieces came to be and to touch on the process of public writing more generally.
Great. Well, thanks to you both, Joseph and Becker, for inviting me, and also Bill, who couldn't make it, for inviting me to participate and to talk about the process of writing. It is a little tricky, I guess, because you don't want to come across as like this is why my writing is so great. But so I'm going to try to finesse this sort of rhetorical challenge and see if I'm able to pull it off. But so what I'm going to do is just make a few comments. We've got lots of time and there aren't too many people here, so we can have hopefully make this conversational rather than presentation. But I'll just make a few general comments, I guess, about writing. I'll do sort of what Joseph was saying, but just in reverse order. General comments about how I think of public writing, and a few just more specific comments to these essays in particular that were circulated, and then we can just open it up. So, I mean, in the general comments, the first thing I want to say, and I don't know if this is blindingly obvious or if this is a little contrarian. It's hard for me to figure out. But the thing that I think is important is that I don't actually see a sharp dichotomy between public writing and academic writing. And I really kind of reject that, that dichotomy. I mean, I think that for the most part, I have tried. I haven't really altered my writing style, whether I'm writing, for a journal article or for for an op-ed or these kinds of intermediate essays that we were circulating. That's not to be too exaggerated about it. I mean, obviously there are certain kinds of differences, but I think of those differences more in terms of audience than I do in terms of like the writing itself. That is to say, the language, the sentence structure, and these kinds of things. And I think it's unfortunate, but it's really easy to slip into binaries between public and academic writing. You know, between whether it's like trade writing or scholarly writing, whether it's kind of the public intellectual versus the scholar. And I think I resist those kinds of binaries because I think they fall pretty easily into sort of caricatures with implied hierarchies. So, you know, in French, people talk about vulgarisation, you know, the vulgarization of your writing, right? And I, you know, in English, the way that I translate that is sort of dumbing down. But I don't think, I mean, I've tried, I don't think that I write that way. I don't think that I think, okay, I've got this like scholarly apparatus, but now I'm going to dumb it down for a different audience. You know, in many ways, I think of that as a very strange way for academics to think in the first place, you know, because I mean, we spend an awful lot of time, most of us, teaching, right? And hopefully we don't think of our teaching as dumbing down, right? We think of our teaching as talking to intelligent audiences. And you know, and so that's the way that I sort of try to think about the writing. And you know, on the other side, on the flip side, the hierarchy doesn't go in one way, right? I mean, many people think of academic writing as just, you know, jargony, overly specialized, overly complicated, and hiding some deep emptiness and silliness. And you know, and I don't really I don't tend to favor overly jargony writing, but jargon has its purposes, right? Jargon, it can hide analysis. It can substitute for analysis at times, but there's a reason that we have jargon, right? I mean, this is one of the ways that scholars communicate to each other. You know, I mean, it has fundamentally, you know, like jargon has a purpose. So I would even defend jargon. So I'll skip over that one. So another point that I think we're going to talk about, so I won't dwell on it, but is that historians are a kind of privileged subset, I think, among academics, because we do have sort of multiple audiences at once, and we have a privileged access, I think, to broader audiences. But you know, we can come back to that. An aspect a third aspect, and then I'll give up on the sort of broad general points is that you know, I think there's also among at least certain academics a tendency to kind of yearn back for an earlier era, for a kind of golden age when, you know, academics were respected by the public, when people, you know, listened to us, you know, we had a voice. And so, you know, whoever you're thinking about, it was like Richard Hofstadter or Lionel Trilling, David Reisman, whatever. These are people, you know, who you know, I mean, it's easy to get nostalgic for these kinds of figures, I think, and for this world that you know, like back then, whatever, audiences didn't watch reality television. They read the New York Times book review and they listened to Hofstadter and Trilling. And it's true that, you know, there was sometimes, you know, when I go back and look at some of those books, you know, I'm surprised at what, you know, Knopf or something was publishing, right? I mean, that probably it was sophisticated and complicated works of scholarly life, right? That seemed to have a pretty broad appetite. So that is, you know, you can't dismiss that, right? But, you know, I think at the same time, there's a lot to sort of bemoan about that world, that lost world of the 1950s and 60s. As there's as much to bemoan as there is to applaud, I think, of that world. That is to say, there was a kind of narrowness in the construct of who figured as a public intellectual, what their sort of status and authority, where it came from, you know. And I mean, it's no accident that most of those figures, maybe, I mean, the one who jumps to mind as an exception is Hannah Arendt, but most of them were men. Most of them were attached to Ivy League universities. I mean, there's not, you know. So I don't have a yearning to go back to that world of the sort of public intellectual. I mean, I think today there's a much more complicated, broader, fiery, you know, public world of writing, which is mediated not just through like the New York Times Book Review or the New York Review of Books, but through blogs, through, you know, through Twitter. It gives a much bigger voice to all kinds of people. And so I think that's cause for celebration, actually. Okay. So in terms of my own writing, when I think that I often write with an imagined reader in my head. And so for most of my books, I think, well, there's only two, for both of my books, the imagined reader I think of as the kind of smart undergraduate in the classroom, right? So it's somebody who, so again, this helps me avoid the sort of dichotomy between, you know, this is something for an academic audience, or this is something for a public audience. I mean, it's both, right? You know, sometimes it might be like your aunt or uncle who's interested in what you're working on, right? I mean, but this is the way in which, I mean, those are in many ways, the aunt or uncle was once the smart undergraduate. So, you know, these are in many ways the same kind of audience. And it's a way of communicating complicated ideas to those people. I think it's easy. It's certainly been easy for me to get in trouble when I try to, when my intended reader is a kind of like, you know, the Harvard professor that I really want to impress with my intelligence and you know, with the complexity of my ideas. That leads me down dangerous paths, I think. So, but again, you know, there are uses for that. You know, sometimes the reader is the graduate seminar, and I honestly think there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that is a part of our audience, right? And so there should be writing. Not all writing, you know, goes to the New York Times, right? There should be writing that should be for a graduate seminar. That is a big part of what we do. So these aren't, again, you know, just to kind of come back to that, it's not like a hierarchy, one is better than the other. These are just different audiences. They're different intended readerships. So the Chronicle piece is an interesting one. I mean, the two pieces that were circulated are unusual. I mean, this is definitely a recent turn for me in terms of what I write about and think about academic administration. It's because of my experiences in the academic council for the last few years. And sitting in on some of these, you know, debates and conversations. So the Chronicle piece was clearly written, I think, for other academics. I mean, its intended audience, you know, it's the Chronicle of Higher Education, right? Its intended audience really was my colleagues at Hopkins and beyond. But that one has a kind of like funny initial genealogy. That actually began as an email to my colleagues on the academic council. I was like angry and worked up about something. And so I started writing this email, and it just got longer and longer. And then before long, I realized that it was going to be one of these crazy ranting emails that, like, you know, gets shot out at 3 a.m. And so then I decided, okay, maybe I'm not going to do that. And then I was like, what? I'm not going to bludgeon my poor colleagues in the academic council with this crazy rant. Let me see if I can turn it into something more interesting. And so then it took about a month to write. I needed to take some breaks from it. I kept adding on the research. You know, I was looking through these IRS reports and I kept digging up more stuff. Some of the research was just Googling, you know, like the stuff about Ron Daniels in a, you know, getting his money for the directorships at T. Rowe Price or whatever. It's actually amazing how much is possible now just to come up with this stuff. In a funny way, the intended readership for that essay was one single figure, and that is Ron Daniels himself. And I must say it was kind of incredibly gratifying for me to sort of imagine him when it did come out, imagine him reading that, because I haven't had many encounters with him, but in the limited encounters with him, I haven't gotten the sense that he takes, you know, he's a very good listener, or that he takes the things that I say very seriously. And so it felt gratifying to feel like, you know, I had been able to say something that would land a punch, you know. But actually, in certain ways, he's a good example of like a reader, right? I mean, I don't know, as I say, I don't know Ron Daniels very well. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but I think of him as, you know, like informed, smart, not overly sort of intellectual in the sense of like, you know, his I don't know exactly what his law scholarship is about, but you know, it's fairly disconnected from the kind of work that happens in our departments. You know, so a certain kind of broad intellect without being overly specialized. So actually, he's a pretty good, you know, imagined reader. The Chronicle essay led to the American Prospect essays, and that was because Bob Kuttner got in touch with me, who's the editor of the American Prospect, and he's a guy who's writing. He writes a lot. I mean, he's a blogger and prolific sort of short essayist. And I've admired his stuff for a long time because he strikes me as somebody who's completely fearless. And he seems to like the sort of hand-to-hand combat, you know, in the blogosphere or whatever. And so I quite honestly, I don't really know who reads that magazine, the American Prospect. I think it's, you know, it's more of a crossover than the Chronicle of Higher Education, I think. but my sort of imagined reader there was, Kuttner, like the bearded curmudgeon or something like that, who wants to like stir things up a little bit. And I felt at some liberty in those essays to really, to allow myself more leeway, from my kind of scholarly persona, I guess. I wanted to be at once polemical while also allowing for the complexity of the main point of that essay, insofar as there is one, is that American higher education is very complicated, right? It's very complicated and paradoxical and contradictory, and so even while allowing for the complicated nature of higher education in the United States, I wanted to be polemical and to land some more punches. So those were that was the process of those. The last thing I'll say, and I'll stop here because I think I've already gone beyond my 10 minutes, but the last thing I'll say is about the Chronicle was a really interesting writing experience for me, because it began with a lot of anger. It began with a lot of anger at the decision making, the way the decision making was happening at that moment in April. The decision to suspend retirement contributions, and in particular, I don't care that much. About the personal hit, although of course I do, but it's not like that wasn't the primary motivator. The prime motivator was that the process of decision making, the unilateral process of decision making, and that fed into a pre-existing anger. And I had experienced a lot of anger over the process of the tenure committee, the new tenure committee that had been put in place. And this was, this one I was intimately involved with this process. As a member of the academic council, which was now being sort of like demoted, and I viewed the tenure process as basically a sort of takeover of tenure decisions by the president, and I had been very bruised by that whole process. So I had a lot of unprocessed frustration and anger, and so the process of writing that essay was at once cathartic because it allowed me to really let loose on that, but also it required a lot of discipline. This is why it took about a month to read, because it required me. My objective there wasn't to was specifically not to bludgeon the reader with my anger, right? Not to bludgeon the reader with my outrage, but to try to restrain my anger and outrage sufficiently that the reader could experience that on my behalf. That was what I was aiming for, and that was a really hard thing to do, especially when I'm feeling that level of frustration. That was it required it required me to really try to pare things back, to pull away some adjectives, to share my writing with people who were going to tell me, like this is too strong, or this is you're going off base, to allow myself to be criticized for those aspects. And so that was a hard sort of exercise, but it helped reinforce something which I've learned over the process of kind of writing these kinds of essays, which is, in general, more is less, right? So there is a way in which this kind of writing is different, not from our academic writing per se, but from our academic ways of thinking, right? Like academics revel in complexity, or at least historians, of course, it's much more complicated. Everyone will always agree if you say, of course, it's much more complicated, but, in many ways, the challenge of writing, both academic writing and public writing, is to simplify, right? So it kind of goes against our scholarly instincts. And so that's kind of the challenge, to simplify without caricature, without over exaggeration. So anyway, I'll stop there. We have lots of time to talk, so see what people have to say.
Becker, do you want to start with a question? You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. So François, I'll pick up on this thread that you brought out about your recent public writing, and then I want to go back a little bit in your own kind of biographical history and how public writing has changed, and the relationship between history and public writing and so on. But to pick up on this thread, so I think very recently, you've kind of shifted your own public writing toward universities. So what role do you think public writing has in bringing universities to account, right? Clearly, you think it has some very kind of prominent role, especially if you publish in the trade publications of universities, right? Like the Chronicle of Higher Education. You spoke a little bit about your intended audience, but is there a role beyond that you think public writing in general, by especially tenured faculty, can play in kind of shifting our own understanding of the university, and also maybe even shifting the university's actions themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I would be eager to hear what other people, who are in this conversation have think about that. Mike Johnson started off with a few comments on that, and others have longer and richer experiences than I have with this. I think so. I don't know how much I can generalize. What I can say about my experience here at Hopkins is that I have found in my short time so far in terms of participating in governance that institutional governance is that, number one, it takes a lot of time. It's often frustrating because you don't get your way. Colleagues are crazy, and when you disagree with them, they're completely wrong, and you're completely right. And so it's not easy, right? But there is a kind of like culture of governance, I guess, that exists at least in the sort of faculty level, right? And my experience has been that this sits very uneasily with the way the university is run on the broader institutional level. In fact, I've been quite struck by how much of a contrast there is between this kind of what I might call relatively democratic. Now, grad students might disagree with that, but relatively democratic kind of modes of governance at the departmental faculty, level, versus what is, ultimately a kind of, it's a kind of, autocratic mode of governing. The people who really make the decisions in the university are the board of trustees. That's where the big decisions get made, and they have zero accountability to anybody. They are accountable only to themselves. And the president of the university is at least at this university, but I think this is broadly the governance, is the agent of the board of trustees and carries out the decisions, and has what to me is a kind of opaque influence on who gets onto the board of trustees. I'm not sure how that happens. In theory, the president shouldn't be involved, but I think in fact the president usually is. So the president is accountable to to people he helped appoint, and so this creates a kind of unaccountable and very hierarchical mode of governance, right? So, and I've been impressed at how hierarchical things are at the upper levels. Again, I don't know how common this is. This is just from my perspective. I don't know how accurate my observation is, and I also don't know how common this is across universities. But all this is a way of saying that I found it frustrating to be part of this culture of conversation, argumentation, persuasion, and have that ultimately run up against a culture in which decision making is the decisions are made and they're carried out, and so it feels as though there's an awful lot of effort at this level to come up with things that are then just summarily dismissed. And so what that has meant to me is that this writing was one of the only ways that I feel as though I could actually communicate with, ironically, with people who I should be in stronger communication with. I called it landing a punch earlier, but I think I think there has been more. Response to this kind of pressure, in part because the institution, I think, is acutely sensitive of its kind of image, and maybe here is one of the few places in where these people can be held to some level of accountability, because image really matters, and if the image is tarnished, then that hurts, I think, the board of trustees. It hurts the upper leadership. So in a certain kind of ironic way, this is like, it's a sign of sort of dysfunction, actually, I think, of dysfunction in modes of governance, right? That there's a need to, but it's also my personality, I suppose, there are other people who function much more effectively, right? In those ways, who have the right kind of temperament to function and who probably have ultimately more influence than I will ever have, right? So I don't know, this is not a psychotherapy sort of session here, is it? But that's what I would say, that it's been a funny outcome of what I view as a kind of institutional dysfunction. Yeah, but I'm happy to have other people, sort of chime in.
Yeah. So I'll ask a quick question, and then we'll open it up to the attendees to ask questions, make comments, just generally have a conversation. And you can just raise your digital hand again, and then I'll allow you to talk. I'm sorry that the Zoom session is set up in this way. I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about what impact you think that the Chronicle essay had, what kind of feedback you got, because you you end the essay with this call to action. You know, you end it with a call for the university boards to have seats for faculty, staff, students, and you talk about reform working its way from the bottom up. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about the feedback you got, because it was, you know, this was circulated on social media. I think it found a pretty wide audience.
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to say is that it had way more of an impact than I was expecting. And I think it was almost, surely I think I can say with great confidence, it was more widely read than anything else I've written. You know, I mean, my joke became, you know, like, I wish my scholarship had this kind of impact. I mean, it was widely, I heard from a lot of people. I just had a conversation this morning with a guy at Washington University who wanted to talk about his medical school experience. I mean, not medical, but where he teaches. So yeah, so I was astonished at how it hit a nerve, right? Like and here, you know, I can't claim to, I mean, this isn't, you know, this is what a lot of writing is, right? You happen to say the right thing at the right time at the right place. And that's how I sort of see this, right? I mean, it's not the power of the writing or something like that. It's just that, like, this somehow articulated a lot of pre-existing, I mean, it was a manifestation of the same sort of frustrations that I was feeling. And those clearly were very widely shared at the institution and at other institutions. I heard from a lot of people, and a lot of people in medical schools, to my surprise, where and the conclusion that I came was that medical schools have been at the forefront of the kind of corporatization of education, right? That they've been like ahead of us in the more kind of like arts and sciences fields. And so, but they are obviously very frustrated by the same trends that we're feeling in a lower level. So, you know, I think it's had a surprising impact. I mean, I can't take credit for it. Like I say, it was, I think, you know, I think a lot of people were feeling these things, but it touched a nerve and it was, you know, it wasn't the essay itself. It was the decision-making that had happened that was really angering people, but it helped. I think it was part of a process of kind of catalyzing those frustrations and channeling them into some productive ends, which, you know, we're still in the middle of, kind of like, I think, you know, Jane Bennett talked about this a few minutes ago. She's been very involved in organizing, trying to think about how we reform some of our institutions at the Homewood campus to try to have a stronger voice for faculty in institutional decision-making. There's been a lot of conversations that have been taking place across. The Zoom thing has really helped, actually. The fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic means that it's much easier to connect with people at other institutions and you know, it'd be very hard to organize a meeting where people would actually attend that would bring people from the medical campus to Homewood or vice versa. Whereas on Zoom, you can just do this kind of instantaneously. Everybody's doing it. So that has helped this kind of organizing in conversations. And I think, you know, there has been a response. I mean, the administration has created some bodies, you know, that remain purely advisory, but nonetheless, I think are having an influence. And I think there's a sense of more accountability, a sense of a greater accountability, or at least greater scrutiny. Somebody in the medical school faculty senate was talking about how they've been getting much more transparency on finances of the medical school to the Senate, which is a new thing for him and a good evolution. So I think you know, I think there's some way in which this is catalyzing things. The last thing I'll say, I guess, is the role of tenure. I mean, there's a certain kind of irony, right? Because the big fight that I was involved with and the origins of most of my frustrations, it has to do with the fight over tenure and over who gets to make decisions about tenure. And tenure, you know, is ostensibly to give you protection for sort of academic freedom. But it's academic, you know, I actually think the place where it's most effective in terms of allowing for a certain kind of freedom is not so much in New York Times op-eds or something like that, right? Like, I don't really imagine, whether I had tenure or not, that an op-ed I published in the New York Times would be a dangerous thing for my career. You know, I know that it once was, you know, back in the 50s, and I'm not suggesting that time couldn't come again, but we're not in it, and we haven't been in it, even in the darkest of the Trump, you know, administration times. That I don't think there has been a real threat. Now, the place where it does become really important, actually, is being able to do what I did, like to really speak out strongly against the university's leadership and to feel empowered to do so, right? and so that's a really important thing, to be able to stand up in a meeting and say, you know, that your provost or your president is all wrong, is misguided, you know, and is making very poor decisions. These are not things that one can do in a corporation, right? So so I think, you know, I think that that's an important function. You know, I've been sort of surprised. You know, the joke when I published this was like, well, we'll see if this whole tenure thing actually works, right? I mean, but you know, honestly, it's I don't, even without tenure, I don't think they would have fired me because I wrote a critical op-ed. You know, like, I just don't think. I think, you know, I think I'll give them credit. I think there is a sincere commitment to sort of freedom of speech, but I also think, you know, there's a more cynical PR perspective in which, you know, this just wouldn't be worth the cost. It would make them look really bad to fire me, tenure or no tenure. And so the only thing I'll say about that is that I've been surprised at how many people have told me that this was like a courageous thing to publish, because, you know, because I'm not sure that it, you know, it took a willingness to be sort of curmudgeonly, sure, and but in terms of actual courage, you know, like, I have tenure, I can't be fired. You know, like, why is that courage? The courageous thing is to publish this thing when you can be fired. It doesn't take much courage to publish something that can have no consequences on my, you know, on my professional status. So I don't think of it as a courageous act. You know, like, there are actually somebody who wrote an op-ed in the Hopkins Chronicle, in the newsletter, which was highly critical of the Police Accountability Board and where he was quitting from it. And this guy is not tenured. Now, that was a courageous move, you know. It's courage to do something when you risk real consequences. Like, so all that to say, like, why aren't more academics writing critical pieces? You know, I mean, there are some. I'm not going to be naive. Like, in the sciences, you know, like, someone told me once, you know, like, if I wrote an essay like that, you know, my lab would get moved to a janitor's closet. That can happen, right? And if your grant funding is paying your salary, then you know, and your lab gets moved to a janitor's closet, it's going to be pretty hard to produce good research, and your grant funding will stop, and eventually your salary will stop. So there can be consequences, and so, you know, in the humanities, they can't retaliate that way, or at least it's pretty hard to retaliate that way. So you know, I don't want to exaggerate, right? It still takes some courage, especially if you're a scientist, to publish a critical thing. But we should be publishing more. I mean, we should be saying these. I mean, we have this privilege, you know, to be able to say critical things. We should be doing more of it.
I think Mike had a comment or question.
François, if you were to sit down to try to draft an article about the consequences of the pandemic and what you call the extinction event for many universities, that deals specifically with its consequences for the humanities. What do you see as the kind of major issues there, not just at Johns Hopkins, which is a very special kind of place in the very top tier, but across the whole spectrum of higher education? It seems to me that it's quite possible that the extinction quantity of the event may be visited more heavily upon the humanities than other disciplines, let's say the STEM disciplines in particular, and as well as the ability to communicate in a classroom. That is, that there may be an attempt to turn humanities classes into virtual learning experiences of some kind that you could get on the web. So I just wondered what your thoughts were about that. Are the humanities looking at, you know, the counterpart of the meteor that destroyed the dinosaur? I mean, is that sort of what we've got here?
Well, Mike, you know, I mean, we're historians, right? We're not very good at predicting things that are going to happen. You know, we're better at analyzing them after they did. I mean, I don't know. So honestly, of course, I have no idea. I mean, what I wrote in that prospect piece was that I worry that, you know, that it's the big middle that's going to get crunched, you know, institutionally. I'm not talking about disciplines here, but I'm talking about institutions. Sorry, there's a little background noise. I hope that's not interfering. That there's going to be a big middle in trouble. You know, that the elite institutions, Harvard and Princeton or whoever, this won't affect them in a particularly substantive way. Even Hopkins, you know, if you look at our revenues from from tuition, they're pretty small, right? So as a percentage of our overall revenue, so it won't affect us too much. And then the big state, the community colleges in the state, you know, they never much relied on private tuition anyway, or at least room and board tuition. They won't be fundamentally affected. The community colleges, you know, they have other sources of income that didn't rely on principally on tuition. So those, they'll be minimally affected, but that these like middle tier of liberal arts, you know, the big landscape that makes American, you know, academia so interesting, really, will be most affected. And I still think that's my major concern. I mean, how it affects the disciplines, I really don't know. I think it's possible that there are some deeply uncreative administrators that will look and say, you know, why are we paying people to teach classes when in person when they can do it online? That might happen. They predicted that would happen with the MOOC stuff, right? But it didn't. I kind of think it won't, just because, I mean, I think I sort of take the opposite lesson from the pandemic, which is that people really want to be in class. I mean, they're taking, you know, say what you will, like about craven administrators reopening campuses to, you know, to keep the tuition dollars flowing or whatever, the room and board dollars flowing. They can't do it by themselves, right? The students have to want to be there. And there's this incredible desire for students to be on campus, to be taking classes in person, amidst some pretty severe risks, you know, and some pretty severe constraints. I mean, some of these people are just like locked down and not having much fun, I imagine, and they're still here. So they obviously desperately want to be in class. So that to me signals that our model isn't going to go away right away. I also counterintuitively tend to wonder why the humanities field would be more at risk than the STEM fields. I mean, the thing that really strikes me is that humanities fields are really cheap to teach. You know, all you have to do is you get a professor and you pay that professor whatever they earn. You don't have to pay them a whole lot. And then you can have like 25 people in a room. I mean, that's a pretty good business model, you know, whereas the STEM fields are really quite expensive. You know, they require labs, they require huge startup costs, they require these people to get grants, and if they're not getting grants, your institution is on the hook. They don't teach very much. You know, so actually, if I were an administrator, I mean, I don't have an MBA and it shows here probably, but if I were inventing a university for a COVID times, I think I would be inventing a humanities and social science oriented institution, and I would completely give up on the STEM fields because they're too damn expensive and too many fixed costs, too much risk to take on for uncertain pandemic, you know, educational times. So that's what I would say. We probably won't go in that direction because administrators all think alike, right? They all get trained in the same places and they all get drummed that STEM is the way to go. So I'm not suggesting that this is where we're going to go, but I just tend to think there are some sort of like economic imperatives that might work in our favor rather than against us, if us as being the humanities.
Jane?
Thanks, François. It's all really interesting in that last question also interested me. I just have a small point, which is, I guess I'll start by saying, look, you're too modest, because that piece in the Chronicle, it was a catalyst, and it was an act of courage, because one thing that I've noticed over the years that I've been at Hopkins, I used to teach at liberal arts colleges. And when I moved to Hopkins, it was like the working conditions were so awesome, the pay was so much better, the freedom was so much greater. And yet I was surprised at how lack of courage people had. You know, they got tenure. And so I just wanted to say that it was an act of courage, and acts of courage are contagious, that thing I noticed. And so over the summer, and more than I've ever seen at Hopkins, I came to the university in, I think, 2004. More than I've ever seen is people who have courage are now encouraged to speak out, and more people are catching courage. So I just wanted to say that. And then the only other thing I wanted to ask you about was the role of a kind of aversion to legal risk in this whole story of autocratic governance at the university, and not just at Hopkins, but across the country, really, for private universities, especially. I guess I just wanted to ask you, you know, like there's often these decisions come down and they're described as nobody's decision except the lawyers. The lawyers set the tone and then we have to obey what they say. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Can you just explain what you mean by legal risk? You mean like legal, like liability in terms of lawsuits from students who would have caught COVID, you mean, or?
Yeah, yeah, and that a lot of decisions are couched in terms of this has to be done so as not to get, you know, so we're not liable to suits, you know, yeah.
I'm not sure how much I can say about that. I don't, that piece of it is somewhat invisible to me, I think.
Well, also, for example, this might help give a sense of what I mean. Like, you know, faculty can't use the university lawyer because the lawyer represents the interests of the university, which has to do with minimizing its financial risk of lawsuits. So I'm wondering whether a kind of, I don't know, whether that could be changed too. If we're talking about big changes at the university, like getting some faculty representation, student representation on the board of trustees, which is going to be a big uphill battle. Also, it seems to me that not having access to the legal things from the university and all the legal office, the whole legal office is always oriented towards protecting the financial risks of the university rather than, say, you know, justice on the part of some dispute. Yeah.
I mean, yes, I think it's true. I mean, I think that you know, I mean, who sits on the board of trustees? These are, you know, I mean, I think a lot of them are from finance, right? They're from hedge funds and other things. You know, if you watch that presentation on university finance a few weeks ago, that guy kept talking about how our endowment is doing really poorly, that we would be doing so much better if we were in the S&P 500. But, you know, the people who make the big decisions come from a certain world where it just seems obvious that you invest things in big endowments and in hedge funds, and so that's what you do. And I think one could say the same about, you know, about sort of risk mitigation or however they think about these things, right? I suspect, you know, I know that we have a bunch of lawyers on the board of trustees. But even if we don't, you know, even the corporate executives and the hedge fund people, you know, that this is ways that they think, and of course, you know, the university is run, you know, our president is a lawyer, so I think it's a little surprised, you know, that mode of thinking, that mode of the sort of risk aversion, above all, is the way they approach things. So I tend to agree. You know, I must say in the COVID moment, they've been making funny decisions that seem exceedingly risky to me, actually. I would have thought that risk aversion would have led to, you know, excessive shutdowns, keep students away, you know, don't bring on risk of lawsuits. And for some reason, that hasn't been the case. So at times where they're taking risks, and they seem like poor risks to me. I mean, like, that's not where I would choose to risk things. I would choose other places to take risky sort of bets, you know? I don't know how much more I can say about that. I just think, I think it's true that the university, you know, the number of lawyers employed by the university has grown a lot. Some of this has to be inevitable between, you know, I mean, most of our revenues come from federal grants, right? And so these have tons of regulations behind them. I mean, I know that, like, for instance, I can't remember, there was some story about an anthropologist, I think, who wanted, or a student who wanted to go to Iran to do research, and this became really complicated, right? Because would this jeopardize Hopkins's federal dollars or something like that? So these things do get complicated in ways that, you know, it isn't really the administration's fault. But, you know, but then they do sort of lean into it, right? Where the lawyers get involved in everything. The other place where the lawyers got involved, of course, is OIE stuff, right? That's also, I tend to be a little more sympathetic with the administrators here, right? They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to the regulations, you know, the Title IX stuff. They could probably handle it with greater courage, but you know, that's not entirely their decision. But there are many times where they do sort of lean into, you know, to the kind of lawyerly mentality and risk aversion mentality. And I agree, it would help to have I agree with you that it's going to be an uphill slog, but I do think it would help to have a greater diversity of voices in the board of trustees. You know, I mean, so that they're hearing at least alternative perspectives. You know, because I think it's pretty easy. In the same way, you know, like it's easy to in a kind of like history seminar room to just kind of mutter, well, it's more complicated, and everyone nods their head. You know, like in the same way, it's probably easy in a board of trustees room to say, well, you know, let's make sure we're not putting ourselves in legal jeopardy. You know, and everybody would, I assume, nod their heads. I don't know that world, but I think, you know, that kind of groupthink is pretty easy when you know, the sort of like those backgrounds are predominating in the boardrooms or whatever.
So, François, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your own kind of history and trajectory in public writing, and especially the relationship between the field of history and public writing, maybe vis-a-vis other humanities fields. But one of the curious things about your kind of scholarly trajectory is that both of your books, right, were published with Penguin, right, which is a trade press, and trade presses have some kind of let's say unique relationship with history in that there's a more kind of commercial viability with history books as opposed to maybe literary criticism or even art history to a certain extent, right? And so how do you see, maybe start with how you felt, let's say that relationship was when you were in graduate school, right? And maybe how that kind of informed how you developed your career in publishing both of your scholarly books with a trade press.
So when you say liabilities, you mean like the risks and liabilities, meaning like relative to tenure?
Viability, like commercial viability, right? So when trade presses look at history books and consider publishing history books, they're much more viable to just sell than if they're looking to publish, let's say, literary history or literary criticism, which obviously doesn't sell as well in the market, right? So just what is your kind of your history with trade publishing, why you decided to publish your books with trade, and how was this thought of when you were in graduate school vis-a-vis or versus how it's thought of today?
I think if there was a concern about that, it would have been kind of the reverse. That is to say, you know, like, can you get tenure with a book that's published by Penguin as opposed to published by University of Chicago or something like that, right? I don't think I think that concern has sort of decreased over the years. I'm not sure. The story, I mean, the background, basically what was happening with this book, I had sort of hoped that I could write for a, you know, sort of crossover audience. I had tried one or two places. I'd submitted to a couple, just sort of like, I think just sending to editors that I'd heard about or something like that. And I wasn't having any luck. And then I was moving to submit. So this was originally my dissertation. I was moving to submit with Cambridge University Press. And I had submitted the manuscript, and it was taking them forever to get me readers' reports. You know, it was like a year or something like that. And in the meantime, I got contacted by, anyway, it's a long story, but there was the Penguin thing was it was actually a self-conscious kind of decision to try to construct something that would be like in the mode, I think, of Hofstadter or something like that, right? Like, as I recall, it was Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was like on the head of the editorial board or something like that. And then they brought all these historians in who were kind of writing for both public and, you know, well-respected scholars who also had sort of trade audiences. So like Jill Lepore, Alan Brinkley, I think was one. I can't remember who but I got contacted by Jill Lepore, who I didn't know, who had been on a prize committee for an article that I'd read, and she liked my writing style. And so she said, is this part of a manuscript, like a book manuscript, and would you be interested in submitting for this series? And so I said, sure. You know, I mean, I've submitted, but I haven't heard back from Cambridge. So I wrote the Cambridge editor, and I said, I mean, for me, it was kind of a no-brainer, actually. It was like, this would be thrilling for me, you know? So it took no, you know, the only delicate part was whether I was gonna, you know, what to do about the Cambridge thing where I had submitted. So I wrote the Cambridge editor, and I said, you know, just FYI, I'm going to submit to this, you know, it's been solicited. I haven't heard back yet. You know, obviously no contract had been signed or anything like that. He said, okay, you know, so I sent it to Jill, and they made a decision in like 2 weeks or something like that, you know, I mean, and I still hadn't, he then sent me one reader's report. The second reader's report still wasn't back. And so I finally got the second reader report, but after Penguin already said they were willing to take it. So that's what happened. So I went with Penguin. The guy was upset at Cambridge, but you know, if he'd been a little quicker, it would have been too late for Penguin. So it's a funny, you know, sometimes those readers report delays can work in your favor. The experience of writing with Penguin was great. I mean, the editor was incredibly engaged, incredibly smart. He did line editing. He did a kind of editing that I don't think people get really for the most part with academic presses. So there's a few academic press editors out there that I know who do that kind of work, but very few. Most of them just kind of shepherd books in and out. You know, they might have read the introduction, but basically they'll send to readers who rely on the readers to give the feedback and back and forth. So I had a wonderful experience, actually. I had a wonderful experience with them. I thought there was an incredible engagement. I thought it improved the book a lot to have his feedback and to respond to this feedback. It was as smart or smarter than the feedback I had gotten from other academics. So I really appreciated that level of attention. The market is a funny one. I'm pretty sure both of my books have lost money for Penguin. I'm pretty sure. Like I don't know why they, I doubt they would sign me for a third book. I don't know. Maybe they will. I mean, you know, to some extent, I think they're happy to have like serious nonfiction that will, you know, lose a little bit of money, but show that, you know, that they're still engaged. You know, this is Penguin Press, which is like a little imprint within Penguin. And I think there is a way in which these people take their job seriously. You know, that is to say they think it's important to publish serious nonfiction, and some of them will lose money, some of them won't. I mean, I remember I had a conversation once with like Harper's, where they were about to publish, I can't remember. I think it was Sarah Palin. So this is and I remember the agent, I was working with an agent, and he was like, this is like their yours would be the conscience money or something like that. They're feeling bad about it. They're going to make tons of money off Sarah Palin, but they're feeling a little bad, so they want to throw some. So that's one way of looking at it. You know, it's like dental floss or something for them. They're getting their hands dirty, but they're making money over here, but they can do stuff that they're really interested in on this side. I mean, I don't know what the editors, you know, I remember meeting with a lot of editors for the second book. And the key thing for me was to find an editor who shared the vision, you know, somebody who I was going to be working with, who would help me like make this the best book that I could. So it wasn't so much about like, just like signing with whoever. You know, that one didn't work out as well in the sense the person I signed with, because I really admired the feedback, I was excited to work with her. She left shortly after I signed the book. And so then I got a different editor who was fine, but it was, you know, so these things, I mean, it's a different world, right? I mean, there's a lot more movement. But I found it to be very serious engagement, very, very serious engagement, and a very rewarding, you know, sort of experience. And I never felt pressure ever in either of those books to sort of dumb down to say, you know, you got to take that out, or that's too, you know, I never got that feedback. It was sharpening and clarifying, but it wasn't like, no one ever said this is too complicated, our reader's not going to get this or anything like that.
And how about the field of history, and let's say the kind of broader relationship that the humanities has to trade publishing, both in the book form, but also in the form of book reviews, right? That is something that historians do very often, right? Is write book reviews for many kinds of publications, whether magazines, newspapers, etc. So how do you see that relationship, and maybe how it's evolved or remained relatively stable since the time that you were in graduate school?
Yeah, I think this is one of the great pluses about being a historian. You know, I mean, it's one of the things I love is that we have a built-in public audience, right? In a way that other disciplines don't necessarily have. So, you know, like, yes, I mean, it can be annoying. You know, you're trying to have a drink somewhere and somebody keeps talking to you. They find out you're a historian and they're going to talk to you about Pickett's Charge or whatever, or like, you know, they find out that I wrote about the French people in the American Revolution. And they're like, well, the color of the buttons, you know, like on the uniform, blue or red, or, you know, you're like, I don't know. But you know, so that's the downside. But the upside is that people really are interested in this stuff. I mean, they really get passionate about it, right? You know, and everybody wants to be a historian. You know, Cokie Roberts, you know, used to write books about history. Like Bill O'Reilly writes books about history, right? And people read that, you know. So I view that as a really wonderful thing. You know, like there's like a history section in the airport bookstore, and you know, I think that other disciplines don't have that automatic public interest, right? Like there tend not to be like, you know, anthropology sections in the bookstore or sociology sections in the airport bookstore or whatever, right? So that ability to attract to have people get interested in this stuff and to talk to you about what they're reading and to ask you for suggestions on what they should be reading, is a way in which, I was talking earlier about audiences. It's a huge advantage for us. It's a way in which we are able to speak to audiences in ways that are much harder. And our writing, as you say, like people, you see more book reviews by historians in the times than you will by many other fields, right? But so like our writing. I mean, I think one of the things that people like about historical writing, like I've thought of myself as a kind of like mediocre historian, but a good writer. I mean, one of the things that is rewarded actually is like the quality of your writing in a way that, in a more kind of social science, like in many social science fields, like you're expected to write in the passive voice, right? I mean, you're expected to write in this what I find very off-putting way, and I've never understood why that is. I mean, I think it has something to do with the social science aspect and people want to appear more science. But why do scientists have to write in passive voice? Why do these health articles? Anytime I've dipped into a health article, which I don't really understand, like a medical journal article, it's written in this way. And it's not necessary to write that way, but they mostly do. It lends some authority or credibility or something like that. So, but for a historian, there would be no professional advantage to writing in that mode, right? There would only be professional disadvantages to writing with a clunky passive voice style. So both the built-in audience and both the ability, both of the sort of professional rewards or the professional advantages to writing with clarity are I think something that are good. I mean, I think maybe it's one of the reasons I was drawn to history. I don't know.
Brad Harmon had a question that he typed into the chat bubble. So where do you see the trajectory of public writing or writing for a public that's larger than the university heading as it relates to pre-tenure and counting institutionally rather than as a writing practice? Yeah.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I mean, and I have a slightly, I guess, better perspective on it, having sat on this, academic council, which is mostly tenure promotions committee for a few years. So okay, there are multiple kinds of public writing, right? Like one thing that I can say with some confidence is that a whole slew of New York Times op-eds is not going to help in your promotion file, I'm pretty sure. So that those kinds of things don't really count, right? The kind of writing that I did, which is to say the writing for, like, I don't think I had any scholarly penalty. In fact, it's obvious that I did, right? I mean, I got tenure at Hopkins because of my books were published with Penguin versus University of Cambridge. Like having a book published at University of Cambridge goes through tenure process, no one will even ask a question. It's possible that when my books, which were with Penguin, came through, someone said, "Wait, why are they being published with Penguin? And does that mean they're not very scholarly?" And there was an answer to that, obviously. And so I don't think there was any. It might have raised a question, but an easily answerable question. So I don't think there was any ever scholarly penalty. But I do think that it's important. I mean, if I were giving advice to scholars who are untenured, I would say it's important to make sure you're doing both. So the Penguin thing is good because it checks both boxes. It checks the scholarly box, and it checks the non-scholarly box. If you're going to publish op-eds, go right ahead and do that, but make sure you're also publishing in journal articles, right, and peer-reviewed journal scholarship. So those are I think, and where it's heading. I mean, I have no better way of predicting that than I do of the like sort of COVID fallout. I mean, I do think there's an increasing interest in finding ways of assessing. I mean, this is part of a conversation about digital scholarship, right? So peer review. I mean, peer review is ultimately what people care about, right? So if your work is peer reviewed and published in digital form, I think that is increasingly, I think maybe not yet, but I think it's increasingly coming to be seen as respectable and something that should count in your promotion file. I think that we might head that way with other kinds of writing. I mean, I think blogs probably won't, but but it's hard to know. I think as as the professoriate, you know, whatever, gets more diverse, I think it's possible there'll be some more open. I mean, these are conversations that are ongoing. I think it's possible there'll be some more openness to thinking about other kinds of writing, other kinds of scholarship as something that matter in a tenure promotion file. But I don't know, you know, I don't know. I don't like. I think these are very slow move. I think these are conservative impulse, like conservative institutions, conservative impulses, and I think if I had to guess, that the tenure, you know, what I've really admired about the the tenure process at Hopkins is how, partly because we're a small institution, is how sort of qualitative it is, and that allows for some risk that allows for these tenure committees to take greater risks than they might at a bigger institution. And I worry that, you know, the new tenure advisory committee is going to push us in an opposite direction, a more risk-averse way, you know, because the further you get from people who really can assess the quality of the scholarship, the more, you know, the more you're like, well, a question mark equals veto. So it remains to be seen within Hopkins where we're going. It also remains to be seen, you know, like the bigger the institution, you know, it remains to be seen as the culture of the institution, right? The more risk-averse places are going to be the last places to value alternative forms of and it's not just by public writing. I mean, I keep saying op-ed, but there are lots of public ways of presenting your ideas and your scholarship and your thoughts that aren't just the New York Times op-ed, right? I mean, there is like, you know, it just keeps proliferating in ways that I'm not very up to date with, but I'm at least able to recognize that there's just more and more venues in which people are being taken seriously. Like, I stay off Twitter because I don't like Twitter, but I know that that's a place where people are communicating a lot, you know, in very serious ways. And so I'm probably not the best person to talk about this, but I think, you know, I think things are probably moving in the direction of openness. That's what I would say, in a direction. Yeah.
So just another question about, let's say, your own kind of reflections on public writing. Is there something, or what would you have liked to have known, let's say, earlier in your career about these many options that you had to write for a public audience that you know now, that you have learned after, let's say, these editorial processes, both with magazines and with trade books and so on? What would you like to tell your younger self about public writing?
Well, I think, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think the thing that I heard, I mean, I sort of alluded to this, right? That like the thing that I heard from time to time was it's pretty risky to publish with a trade press, especially your first book. You want to make sure you publish with a academic press. Obviously, I didn't follow that advice. I would say that was the right decision, you know. I think that wasn't a very risky move. It didn't feel super risky at the time, and in retrospect, it feels even less risky. So I think, you know, I would say, but I haven't been a super risk taker. I mean, there are some people, you know, who will just come like scuttle their dissertation and be like, you know, I'm bored of that. I'm going to write a completely different book. That's a big risk. That would be an unwise risk, and I wouldn't have taken that on, and I'm glad I didn't. You know, so I would say measured risks is the way to go with your writing. And yeah, I mean, you know, thinking about who you're trying to speak to. I mean, I think there are people who really desperately want to have like a public audience, and that's fine. You know, that's a good thing. I don't know that I've felt like I need to be on television or something like that, you know, like a Michael Beschloss or something. Like, I mean, that's fine for people who want to go that route. And God knows we could use more intelligent people on television, right? So I have nothing against that, but it's just about thinking about, you know, like what ends do you want to accomplish, right? With when you reach out to a broader, you know, a non-academic public, I guess. Like, what is it that you want to get out of this conversation, right? And what and this engagement, because anything is an engagement of time. I mean, any kind of writing will take away from, if you do this kind of writing, you're not doing that kind of writing, you know. And I mean, I haven't published a lot scholarly wise. I mean, you know, like I don't have like dozens of articles or anything like that. I mean, what I've tried to do with my writing, both scholarly and non-scholarly, is to, you know, write. I write somewhat slowly, but try to have a bigger impact, and so far that's sort of worked. And you know, there are people who write much more quickly, much more fluidly than I do. But you know, so I would say, you know, trying also maybe to think about where your strengths lie and focusing on those or whatever, not trying to do something that you're not temperamentally or, able to, or going to do well anyway? That's a tricky question. That's also a tricky one to answer with some level of humility. So I don't know what to say.
Do we have any more questions or comments from the attendees? I don't see hands. I think we have time for one more question, and maybe I'll just ask that question to bring it back to the Chronicle essay. And you touched on this a little bit before. You talked about trying to balance the polemical with, I guess, while also allowing for complexity and restraining your anger in ways that you felt were productive. I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about that. You said that you sent out drafts to people to read. Like, what were the conversations you were having with people? What were your strategies, your writing strategies, as you thought about how to set the tone for the piece?
So the writing strategy was to look carefully at every adjective that I was using, and pull as many of them as I could out, as I could bear to pull out, because like I said, I wanted it to feel more understated than I was. I mean, it started out in such an overstated way. And there was something cathartic to writing that out, just to get that seething anger on the page or whatever, that feels good, but it's not going to be, I recognize it's not going to be effective writing. So how to sort of manage that? I mean, adjectives are the key place, right, where you overstate things. So, and there are always, there are adjectives that I that are, that I don't like, I don't know if this is an adjective, of that ilk or whatever, right? I mean, ilk always has a certain kind of association. People use it a lot, and yet, so try to these loaded kind of words, right? Try to pull them out, and so that when they do come in, they come in with greater effect, right? With greater punch. Sharing with people whose temperaments I trust, who have who are able to, with people who might have served as department chair, or who might have, who might be able to see a bigger picture. I tend to get locked into my righteousness, my sense of I am on the side of the angels and they're on the side of the devils, and there's an awful lot of that, I must confess, in academia, I think. And so when I see it elsewhere, I dislike it. And so when I see it in myself, I don't like it. So being able to share with people who don't have that temperament, who aren't going to be yeah, but who are going to be well, I sort of see what you're saying, but isn't it more complicated than that? So, and being able to take those things on. I mean, this is also something that I encourage for my, in grad students, for scholarly writing, if you're going to take on a historian's argument, and we always do, right? That is how we frame our arguments. We are engaging with other scholars. Make sure that you're characterizing that argument fairly. If you caricature that argument and then dismantle it, that is a meaningless gesture, it's just pure laziness. So don't do that in your scholarly writing, and don't do that in regular writing, right? If someone's not going to recognize their own perspective in what you're trying to critique, then it's an ineffective critique. So I don't know whether Ron Daniels read that and thought and recognized himself in that. He probably didn't, but enough people with enough reasonable temperaments did, that I think it was more effective for having done that. That one was a highly polemical piece. I don't know whether this might be a bad example actually, but it was a highly polemical piece. But I think, being able to engage, being able to acknowledge complexity while still trying to, reduce it or something like that is the it's some kind of, it's a line to navigate, I guess, more than anything, right?
So I just wanted to thank François. We've come to the end of our time. I wanted to thank François for sharing his pieces and for sharing his reflections on public writing, on the current situation of universities, and many other topics that we spoke about today. So thank you very much, François. And thank you to all our attendees who asked questions, who participated, and who listened in on our conversation today. Thank you very much. And we will see you, we will announce the next series, I believe, of talks in the spring and conversations in the spring.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much for being here. Okay, see you all in person soon, I hope.
Take care. Take care.